Keep your head up, keep your head up, keep your head up. We'll make it through. We'll make it through. Keep your head up, don't let it drop. We'll make it through. And we'll make it through.
Hello to our viewing audience. Welcome to this week's episode of Heads Up, a program about mental health and wellness. I'm retired school counselor Sue Mullen, and with me is my co-host, licensed marriage and family therapist Diane Vaccarello. Diane Vaccarello.
Sue Mullen.
Hi, good to see you.
Great to see you too. How have you been?
Good. I had a good week. How about you?
Excellent week.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm waiting for the snow to fall.
I know. It felt like it was going to. It was pretty chilly, but rain.
Yeah, and we can always use the rain because
exactly.
you know there are two conditions in New Hampshire, right? There's flood and drought.
True.
So yeah, we can always use the rain.
Exactly.
So Diane, we are looking at our fourth episode talking about sort of the global concept of wellness, which, according to the Wellness Institute, has 6 components to it. And one of those components is the intellectual component, which we're going to be talking a little bit about today.
Yes.
And our audience doesn't know this, but we do because we entertained each other with the idea that just today we had 2 totally different ideas.
That's true.
About what that intellectual component was comprised of. So, as I always do, I'm going to give you just a little bit of a lead in with what the Wellness Institute has to say about it and then ask for your thoughts on it.
Excellent.
Sound like a plan?
It does.
Okay, good. So the Wellness Institute describes the intellectual dimension as being about expanding your knowledge, skills, and abilities through personal growth and development, and basically maintaining an open attitude to learning about all kinds of different things. So maintaining an active and open mind, seeking out opportunities that stretch and challenge your mind, stimulating creativity and problem solving. That is one packed sentence.
That is a very extensive explanation of intellect.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that because I think part of what we have talked about is how each one of these components affect the other. And I do think that we've been talking about like growth in all these areas. How do you stretch and exercise certain muscles? You know, we talked about physical, and there's the brain is a massive muscle, right, in terms of like stretching and growing and continuing to evolve and develop. And so if we are stagnant and we don't do that, you know, what does that look like?
A good point. Very good point. Let's think about stereotypes for a minute.
Okay.
So when I first said to you, I want to talk about the intellectual dimension, did you automatically think, oh, smart people?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
It's interesting because the reality is that every person, regardless of ability or disability, has an intellect. That intellect is able to manage varying degrees of information, but we all, at some level, are thinking about things all the time.
True. When are we ever not thinking?
Right.
I mean, it's an interesting concept, the idea of doing nothing but thinking about nothing. I mean, I think we can have like you know, we talk about meditation and trying not to get attached to a thought or an emotion, right? And just letting it kind of pass through. But we can't really control that something pops up, but we can decide what we focus on.
So when you're treating people, do you have to actually cue some people into taking time to think?
I find mostly it's around people perseverating on certain thoughts over and over, but not necessarily expanding. I think what I end up doing quite often is talking about identifying what the thought is, maybe what the emotion is that goes with that. But the cognition, it's sort of deciding, is this useful, or do we need to replace this cognition, this thought, with something different that works better?
So you're basically challenging people's thoughts sometimes.
Yes.
Okay.
I would say so.
Yeah. How important is it to people to be perceived as being smart?
Well, I think it probably smart is identified in various ways. So one of the things that I was mentioning and we were talking about earlier was the idea of, intellectual quotient or IQ and EQ, which is emotional quotient, and both can be perceived as intelligent forms of intelligence and smart, right? But I think today we're really focusing on more the intellectual quotient in a sense, the idea of developing different thoughts and cognitions, but that it doesn't just mean reading books and doing research. It can be expanding that through different hobbies and exploring different subjects that you don't know much about, right? In order to grow your knowledge. But then what? What do we do with that? I think is maybe important for us to talk about today. And why is it important that we don't just stop there and absorb information only?
I think that I think people sometimes feel guilty sort of following their heart or following their passion into intellectual pursuits, because at least in my limited world, which is the small neighborhood of Bedford, New Hampshire, yes, reading books and magazines, but also things like being a patron of the arts, doing a certain amount of travel. All of those things are really intellectual pursuits, are they not?
Absolutely, stimulating for the brain. And the more exposure we have in a lot of ways, I think that it lends itself to figuring out what type of a thinker we are, what type of a learner even. That idea of open-mindedness and being malleable or flexible with our thoughts and ready to take on new thoughts, I think is a really strong sign of mental wellness. And it actually contributes to physical health too, because we feel capable and stronger, I feel like. So one of the things that's also interesting is when you were talking about traveling and arts and music, all of these things that we are looking at as far as expanding intellect, and the idea you mentioned earlier in our conversation, the idea that like when someone is studying the arts and music, how that reinforces their ability to learn a language, for example.
Yes.
Because the ear, can pick up subtle inflections and things like that, but it's exposure and it's really allowing our brains to be malleable.
It's funny that you should say that, because when I was still actively employed in the school system, I frequently would have kids, because my population was middle school, I would frequently have kids come into my office and complain about something that they were studying. Like, why do we have to learn algebra? I'm never going to use algebra in my entire life. Why do we have to take an art class? I can't draw, I can't. And to your point that the brain is a huge muscle, different parts of the brain are stimulated by different activities.
Exactly.
So whereas, the traditional reading, writing, not so much arithmetic, but reading and writing stimulates one part of the brain, music, math, the arts can stimulate a totally different part of the brain.
Exactly.
And if you're talking about wellness, we go back to that idea of trying to be a balanced person, right?
Right, and the whole big picture of our
and challenging yourself outside of your comfort zone.
Exactly.
Yep.
That is a really important piece of, if we can continue to challenge ourselves, learn more information, absorb that in a way that, again, then what? If we can bring that to also other people or be open-minded to receiving information from others, it also is a connecting kind of thing too. One of my favorite pastimes is finding antiques and like learning about them. It's all about sort of like gathering information and understanding what that was used for, but it's more because I'm connecting with a person who's telling me the story.
Right.
And that's really interesting to me, and there's just something about it I can't really explain other than if we just go follow our passion or pursue what brings us joy in that sense, learning is very easy, right? You just want to keep doing more of that. And it's not that feeling of like I have to sit down and get a certain amount of information to absorb into my brain. It's much more of a flow.
It's funny, I just put my golf clubs away for
Oh,
the
yeah.
season.
Aw.
It is
December.
It is December.
Yes.
So hope springs eternal. But in New
That's
Hampshire,
true.
you do not play golf generally
yeah.
beyond the first part of December.
Yeah.
And one thing that I particularly like to do, because I've never truly been an expert at anything but a teacher of many things.
I love that.
I love taking people out on the golf course and teaching them sort of the fundamentals of playing golf, because in my mind, golf is really geometry.
Wow.
And so being able to put it into a framework rather than, winning and losing and score and whatever, that, you're standing here in space and time and you've got to get this little orb there. What kind of angle do you have to attack this at? And at what kind of speed?
Right. Physics.
In order to get that orb from your feet to where it wants to be. And it's really pretty intellectually stimulating when you think of it as being a math problem.
I also do fencing, which I have found to be more intellectually stimulating sometimes than physically stimulating. It's both, but it's really trying to kind of read if there's any tell from your opponent to see where you want to sort of like enter into that space. And I think there's so many things in life that are that way, and it's sort of like a physical chess, a game of chess in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell me a little more about this. The tell. So are you looking? You can't see somebody's eyes in fencing, can you?
No, there's a mask, but sometimes you can. There's almost like an energy that you can read, or maybe a little bit of a flinch, or a movement that will indicate where they might be heading next. And so it's really important to pay attention to those kinds of things.
Okay.
And so in that sense, you're already pre-planning sort of what it is that your move is going to be.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
Though we've all seen at least Olympic fencing.
Sure, yeah.
So we know about the lunging and dropping back and all of that stuff, but I never thought of it as really kind of
very, in my opinion, intellectually stimulating.
Investigation, if you will, of the other person. And
very much.
Yeah. Hobbies are an interesting way, I think, to sort of provoke intellectual stimulation.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that there are tons of opportunities in our community, at the very least, in terms of book groups.
Yes.
And theater groups, groups that go and see plays and then discuss them or whatever.
Right.
One of the tenets that I read when I was prepping, in fact, the producer of the show made fun of me a little bit for being the prep person, but
thank goodness.
Let me read this to you. It is better to stretch and challenge than to become self-important and unproductive. What does that statement mean to you?
Well, I think if someone imagines that they know everything, there's a block, I think, that could come up for further knowledge and further learning.
Because people feel that they don't have to learn because they already primarily know everything?
Exactly. And I think it's a shutdown in many different ways for that person, even psychologically at some level. It certainly seems like it could be a shutdown in terms of like relationship, because I think the idea that, if we become too self-absorbed with our learning or don't come outside of ourselves, and again, whether that's sharing that or experiencing that with someone at some level, or being able to like be open to learning from someone else, there's got to be something, always that we don't know, and how could we know everything? So it's not finite.
I'm kind of fascinated by that idea of self-importance, because having spent my time dealing with a lot of kids and families,
sure,
sometimes younger people don't know that they're coming off as being self-important. In kid language, we say you don't want to be a know-it-all, because nobody likes the know-it-all. But as an adult too, if you think that you know everything about an issue or a subject, then Right. Why would you listen to somebody if you think you know it all?
Right. Why would you ever?
Why would you listen to somebody else's opinion?
Right. And I don't think it's possible to stop learning in some ways. I mean, I think that a person could be shut down or closed off. They could have an inflation of their ego that makes them think that they are very important and know everything. But I think if we can take a curiosity type of approach and a not knowing, who was it that said the more we know, the more we don't know? I mean, that's true, right? That we, when we're more open in this world, I think we realize how infinite it is in terms of knowledge.
Well, and I think it's every parent's joy when their own children finally get old enough to acknowledge that maybe their parents actually know a few things.
Exactly.
Right.
Or that they themselves don't know everything they thought that they knew. Yeah, and be okay with that, because it means they need to learn.
Right.
You know, and that's not a bad thing.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So what is your take on the idea that an informed person is an intellectual person? So, in other words, let me ask this question in a different way. I know a lot of people that don't read a magazine, don't read a newspaper, don't turn the news on during the day, and feel okay about it, and sometimes even don't want to be abreast of what's going on in the world around them because it's too distressing. So as a therapist, what would you tell somebody? I mean, what would you tell somebody who chooses to kind of check out and not be invested in what's going on around them?
Well, I would invite someone to really think about mode and modality. Like, what is it that is a good or maybe better fit for them to gather information? I do think it's important that we have an awareness of the world around us and issues that are going around all of us. I think it's a responsibility at a certain level. I also think that there are times when if somebody's watching the news or if they're reading too much of one subject, they could perseverate or get too fixated on something and not broaden themselves because they're just looping almost. So I think for some people, watching the news could increase or exacerbate their anxiety or stress level, but maybe having a conversation with someone and maybe reading sort of like or listening to sort of like an abridged version of something is enough for them to gather information, but not necessarily trigger off a sort of anxiety that they don't need to necessarily stay in.
Right.
But I do think visiting and recognizing where our limits are in terms of what information is healthy or important to us, it's constantly evaluating what's most important to us, having something that comes outside of us, and focusing on what we can control and what we can't. Those three factors are really important in terms of sort of filtering information. Because all information isn't all knowledge, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. No, there are many different angles and aspects to things that are happening in your everyday life.
Yes.
And it's not all just based on fact.
Exactly. And some of it is about problem solving in our lives, right? And so we have to sort of like decide what information to take and what information to leave and filter, and ultimately decide what it is that we're doing with this information. And I think the best part of learning and information gathering, I believe, is when we are in a flow. It's not like a stress to be gathering information, or I remember even the days like college days, I'm dating myself, but microfiche, right? And like filtering through. I'm not kidding, like in the catacombs and like literally in this dark space or hole. I couldn't wait to get out and like look at the sunlight, you know. But I did love learning. You know, but I think it's important for us to recognize what works for us, and when we're in a flow, it just falls out. I'm
gonna tell our audience a story about you.
Okay.
I'm going to tell it's a story about you as a parent.
Okay.
And it was probably one of the early on reasons that we became friends as deeply and as quickly as we did.
Excellent.
You had a child who, you have two children, but you had a particular child who was pretty anxious about high stakes testing.
Oh, yes.
And, you know, in the field of education, we like to whip kids into a frenzy over their ability to perform.
Yes.
And you and I spent a great deal of time talking about how we were going to accommodate his concern over this testing.
Right.
And the testing comes, it takes place over a week.
Oh, right, yes.
I never see him. I never hear from him. And a couple weeks later, I run into you and I say, wow, how excited are you that it ended up being a non-event? And you said, well, we did a little prep work with him. And I said, well, what did you do? She said, and you said, we told him that we didn't care how he did.
It's true. Yeah.
And I said, that was it? Yeah, he was not worried about his own performance from his own angle.
Exactly.
He was worried about disappointing you.
Yes, he was worried about disappointing us, and he was also, it turned into not wanting to disappoint himself. The strategy I believe he used was to first sit down, because he would kind of, the fight, flight, or freeze, it would be a freeze, was to sit down and just fill in. There were actual bubbles, if I remember.
Yeah.
Just to fill in, start filling in bubbles. Fake it. Just sort of like start getting the ball rolling. Then as your body calms down, start doing what you feel like in terms of paying attention and focusing and all of that. But in order to get it going, he had to sort of just start filling in bubbles. And turns out he got a really high score on that. And I
don't think we ever determined whether or not that was just luck or circumstance.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
But
but
some of it was both.
It was, I felt like I learned so much from that process.
Yeah.
Because it really drove home for me, at the very least, how the fine line between intellectual curiosity, which is something that we want to support in children and we want to encourage them to want to learn, and that sort of pressure-filled performance aspect.
Like it's a job or a chore.
Right.
It takes away, depending on the person, a certain kind of ownership of that too.
Right, and people start judging themselves based upon scores and performance.
Exactly.
And I am sure, now that you have used the word microfiche in this broadcast, people will realize that you're not as young as they thought you were.
Right.
So I am sure that you can now say in your career, as I have been able to in mine, yea, those many years beyond yours, that I know so many young people that struggled with whether or not they were smart, whether or not they could perform, whether or not they had what it took to be successul.
Right.
Who have gone on to fabulous, fulfilling, satisfying lives that with purpose, and isn't that what we all want?
And I'm thinking of a client I just met with who, you know, had this vision of how to be successful, and when he let go of what that vision was and just sort of allowed himself to do what he feels good at and what he loves to study, right, and reflect on and things like that, he's been so much more successful in his actual career and just in life, but by allowing himself to learn the way he naturally is sort of physically born to do, right? And so that has been a beautiful thing. I feel like when people can own their learning and not learn for somebody else or something else, of course, you know, I think in schools, in our jobs, in just our personal lives with hobbies, if you don't know if you like it, try it and you'll find out, right? And
the purpose of youth is to find a higher sense of self that will move you towards hopefully purposeful employment that adds meaning to your life and to the lives of others.
Exactly.
And at the same time, making learning part of an ongoing process, a lifelong process.
Absolutely.
I hope that when I'm 95 years old, I'm picking up a new habit or a new
hope so,
hobby.
too.
Yeah, you know, I hope that.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's important for us to sort of separate out for people that performance, you know, whether it's grades in school or your paycheck, belongs in one category.
Yes.
But this idea of intellectual curiosity that leaves us open to learning new things
Yes.
and sharing our new talents and skills with other people, that should be a lifelong thing.
I agree. And hopefully that is something that each and every one of us can embrace and realize that it really can't be taken away from us either. We need to just understand that we can be a thriving intellect, right, in this world,
Right.
no matter what that looks like.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So in our last few minutes, Diane, what advice would you have for parents who have kids that want to learn something or do something that the parent themselves is not interested in?
Oh, interesting. Well, I would hope that a parent, if they have the means and the ability to mostly stay out of the way of somebody's dreams, right? Their attempts to learn something, and find what they can do to support that process and happening, and recognize that it's important not to be too tied to the outcome of that, of how it looks or how long it takes or that sort of thing, and more say, you know, give it a try, just show up. It's one of the mantras that I say over and over is just show up, give it a try, and then make a choice,
Right.
you know, then decide. But
And it's important, I think, for us to let our young people know that they don't have to be Olympic caliber, they don't have to be an expert in something, that they can do something for the fun of it.
yes, because if the stakes are too high, A, they're not going to try it, or B, they're going to feel like distracted to the process of actually absorbing and saying, what do I like about this? What do I not like? Do I like it? And the idea of even doing more of that. So again, if we tie ourselves to the outcome too strongly and have an opinion on what that means, then it can get in the way of our curiosity and our enjoyment for learning.
So learning is learning itself?
Actually, yes, very much so. And the idea of experimenting, failing, whatever that looks like, just trying and saying, I'm going to learn more about myself through the process of learning.
All right, thank you so much for
Yes.
spending this time with me today.
Great to see you, as always.
I want to remind our viewers that you can pick up our show on BCTV on demand, that you can listen to our podcast in your car on your way to the grocery store to pick up your own children, and that we will be back next week where I believe we're going to be talking about social wellness.
Wow, yeah. Is that the last of the 6, or we have two left?
Yep.
Great.
Emotional wellness will be our final wellness episode.
Excellent.
And I decided that I couldn't time limit you on that. So, right.
Wow, that's great.
Right.
Okay.
All right. So have a great week, and I'll
too.
see you right back here
Sounds good.
next week at the same time.
I'll be here.
All right. Take care, Diane.
Bye.
Gotta keep your head